do this. I have the pleasure of announcing the next panel that we have with us. This is one that I've been looking forward to, as this is a very important subject. Whenever we get it up on the screen, Confronting Disinformation and Exposing the Axis of Evil. This is a look at the role of propaganda, media warfare, and truth-telling in an era of hybrid conflicts. With us today, we're going to have the founder of DisinfoWatch, a platform dedicated to monitoring and exposing foreign disinformation campaigns. In recognition of his work, he has been sanctioned by the Russian and Chinese governments. This is always an accomplishment, and I had the pleasure of hearing him speak at a panel in February. It was a very lively and enlightening discussion. I present Markus Kolga. Next up is a public intellectual who's been active in the debate on the long-term prospects of Ukraine and its impact on the rest of the world. He is the founder and director of Frontier Institute, a think tank focused on Ukraine's strategic and democratic development, member of the Supervisory Board of National Public Broadcasting Company of Ukraine, and co-founder of the Nestor Group. We have Yevhen Hlibovytskyi. Welcome. Joining us on Zoom will be an American journalist who relocated to Ukraine in 2020 and has dedicated his time since the start of the full-scale invasion to freelance journalism. He has founded Ukrainian Freedom News and provides daily coverage of ongoing events as well as humanitarian support. I welcome online Joseph Lindsley. Then, last but not least, I'd like to present a journalist and fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. He has frequently reported from the front lines, sometimes as close as 2-3 kilometers from Russian positions, if not closer. And this unique proximity gives us a very undiluted and very honest look at the insights on the latest frontline technology being used, as well as disinformation, regional security. I would like to present David Kirichenko. And moderating today's panel is Adrian Karatnycky, and we will be hearing from him in later on panels. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for making my task easier. I've been recruited to do this panel. I'm not Ostap Yarish, who I think was more precisely qualified to lead it, but I will do my best. Let me start by sort of saying that, as Peter Pomerantsev has said, the topic of disinformation is really broadly about the war on reality that Russia has been waging and at other tyrannical societies, but suffice to say, in this case, that Russia has been waging through its proxies and through people whom it has influenced against certain realities. But those realities and the ground for this disinformation could not have grown if the publics of the West and the publics even of the Ukrainian people themselves, had not had a kind of a knowledge base of who Russia is, what Russia represents, and what Ukraine is. From the 1950s, or really from the end of the post-war period, roughly till the Orange Revolution, Ukraine was seen superficially by the West as an unreliable, corrupt, adjunct of Russia and Russian policy. It was seen as an appendage. It didn't have its own identity. I did a piece for the New York Times, for the Wall Street Journal about a year ago, called "When Ukraine Was Invisible." And Ukraine really was invisible in the major media, and when it was dealt with, there were occasional stories about hunting for Ukrainian Nazis in the New York Times, There was even a story when Petro Shelest, who was removed for propagating pro-Ukrainian positions inside the Ukrainian Communist Party, he was presented in a story in the Western media as having been removed because he opposed Brezhnev's intentions for détente and for close relations with the West. So we had a period of disinformation through the period of Soviet rule that operated in a vacuum because there was very little knowledge. The Ukrainian studies was ghettoized, Russian and Soviet studies predominated. And it was in this atmosphere of non-information that it was possible for disinformation to spread. So when Ukraine began to rise, it began to counter a much more spirited Russian disinformation effort. That Russian disinformation effort really began almost at the outset of Ukrainian independence. It began first with Russian early claims for Crimea as an integral part of Russian territory, even during the period of the early Yeltsin period. And Russia's disinformation efforts, Russia's hybrid war is always said to have begun in 2014. But in truth, Russia's hybrid war began almost from the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It took a year or two to get their bearings, and there were some good people in the initial circles around Yeltsin, but one of them was assassinated, some of them were pushed out, et cetera, and very quickly Russia reverted to the mean, to the normal. So the panel that we are, and I think that the very fact that Russian disinformation efforts began so early is the signal of what Russian final intents were about the eventual reabsorption or conquest of Ukraine. This has been a sustained policy. The disinformation effort is not a new phenomenon. It has been accelerated and accentuated. Disinformation will occur in wartime. States, as a waging of war, will conduct psychological operations, some states will conduct massive disinformation, others will hide certain things for wartime ends. That's understandable. But what we know from the Russian conduct over this sustained period, and Soviet conduct before it, is that this war against Ukraine's identity has been waged for a very long time. And so we're happy to have I'm trusting online, 4 people who have been on the front lines of dealing with the consequences of this both historical legacy and this much more dynamic situation. And I guess we will go we'll go in the order that you are presented here, from my right to your left, and try to grapple with these issues. I'd like to ask every speaker to maybe say about 4 or 5 minutes of introductory remarks about their confronting the issue of Russian disinformation. But before I do, I want to make one other point. As has been said, the statistics quoted, it's important to understand that despite the operation of bots and of trolls, and if you get on X and on social media, you think the entire world is arrayed against Ukraine. It is a distortion, because when we look at public opinion, we see great admiration for Ukraine and the Ukrainian cause, even among MAGA voters. I wrote a recent piece that argued that MAGA is not anti-Ukrainian. I mean, that MAGA is actually pro-Ukrainian. There may be differences about the expenditure of large amounts of money to finance the Ukrainian war effort, but there is no case to be made that the majority of Trump voters or the majority of Republicans have a hostile view to Ukraine. They understand what Putin is, they understand what Russia is, and they understand the values that Ukraine represents. To be sure, there is a substantial contingent that has been affected by this kind of disinformation. Unfortunately, One of those people happens to be the main negotiator with Russia, Steve Witkoff. But so in a sense, our panel is about the de-Witkoffization of public opinion. But we should keep it in context. And one last comment is all of the battleground of identity and of a narrative is being waged in the West in a vacuum where people did not have a large knowledge base of Ukraine. They have a much better one now, but it's still a way to go. But that same battle was also waged because of Russian imperialism, Russian and Soviet education and propaganda. The Ukrainian people had to and have had to confront this as part of their evolution towards unity and nation statehood, which they have successfully traversed. Anyway, we'll start first with a person who is on the front lines of both combating disinformation and promoting knowledge and information, which is the best way to deal with disinformation, Marcus Kolga, who deals with primarily the Canadian terrain. So Marcus, give us your best knowledge based on being on the front lines of this battle.
In 5 minutes.
Yes.
One thing I would say about the history of Russian information influence operations is that they didn't start in 2014. They've been doing this for a very long time, over 100 years. I think that those operations started very clearly already in the 1920s and 1930s and have been growing and developing ever since then. There was a pause in the 1990s, but I would say that even the modern phase started in 2007 in Estonia when the Russian government tried to destabilize Estonia's democratically elected government. I want to thank Maria and the Congress for organizing this amazing event and giving me the privilege of joining you here today with such amazing panelists. I feel like I'm an honorary Ukrainian. Usually today I would be at Toronto's Ukrainian Independence Day celebration. This is actually the first year I've missed it since 2014. But I'm glad to be here with you instead. So I'm going to take the next few minutes, 5 minutes, to assess how Russian influence and information operations over the past few years set the stage, really, for what we witnessed in Alaska last week and its aftermath. And I just want to take a second to also acknowledge that today is August 23rd. It is the 86th anniversary of the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, which, of course, impacted all of us here today, also my home country of Estonia. That continues to impact everything that we are seeing today. And it's actually one narrative that we need to continue raising awareness of because it actually does push back against Russia's efforts to manipulate our histories. And so today is that day when we remember the victims of both Nazi and Soviet totalitarianism across Russia. And Andrei, can we get the slides up? Great. And if you can flip to the next one, that would be great. So you probably can't see this because it's huge and I'm sitting in front of it. But I'm often asked how we can assess the impact of Russian information operations. And for that, I usually use an impact scale, and it's scaled from 1 to 5. Now 1, which you see over here behind me on your left, means that those operations have almost no impact. These are narratives and operations that are confined to Russian state media or fringe Kremlin-aligned platforms. On the other side, we have a 5, and that represents the most dangerous outcome. That means a large-scale political, some sort of large-scale political action, like a protest, or at worst, a shift in government policy. And I believe that what we witnessed last Friday in Alaska and in the days that followed was the product of years of unchecked Russian influence operations rising to a level 5 event. Now, President Trump's sudden reversal from his growing recognition of Putin's brutality to what appeared to be an acceptance of Putin's maximalist demands was actually quite shocking and jarring for most of us, but it was no accident. It was the result of years of Kremlin grooming through influence operations. Next slide, please. In Alaska, Putin seemed to exploit Donald Trump's ego and political grievances. In the post-summit interview he had with Sean Hannity, Trump admitted that Putin told him in Anchorage that the 2020 election was rigged, because of mail-in voting, and that Putin assured him that he also believed that Donald Trump had in fact won that election. And by feeding into Trump's deepest grievances, Putin built trust and then weaponized it to advance Russia's objectives in Ukraine, seamlessly converting the US president into a vessel through which Putin laundered and communicated Putin's demands. Next slide, please. Russian state media reflected this immediately, transcribing the Kremlin's demands onto Donald Trump, the rejection of Ukraine's NATO membership and the recognition of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia as permanently Russian. Kremlin ultimatums were laundered as Donald Trump's quote-unquote peace terms. RT's headlines read, "Trump wants Ukraine to make territorial concessions," and "Zelensky rejects Trump's peace terms." This reframing is critical. Hysterically unreasonable Russian demands, territorial surrender, and rejection of NATO suddenly sounded like Washington's demands. And yet none of President Trump's advisors seemed to have warned him that he was being played. Next slide, please. On his social media platform, the president wrote that President Zelensky can end the war with Russia almost immediately if he wants to, flipping the burden of ending the war from aggressor to the victim, a classic Kremlin tactic. Then on Tuesday, this last Tuesday, he again echoed Kremlin talking points, claiming that Ukraine should never have taken on a nation 10 times its size, once more implying that Ukraine started the war, and yet again repeating a primary Russian disinformation narrative. Next slide, please. Now, as difficult as this is to witness, it's not new. For years, the Kremlin has poured billions of dollars into influencing audiences across the North American political spectrum, grooming targeted audience to absorb those narratives. Since 2014, their objective has been very, very clear: to erode US support for Ukraine, incite hatred towards Ukrainians, and to sow doubt about NATO and Western military aid. We now know from documents included in an FBI affidavit last year that the Kremlin spends nearly $1.5 billion annually on global disinformation operations. Next slide, please. In an indictment issued last year, the US Department of Justice charged 2 RT employees of laundering $10 million to build a network of North American far-right, illiberal populist influencers called Tenant Media. Their mission was to weaponize polarizing narratives, including those aimed directly at undermining Ukraine. Many of these influencers were prominent figures within the MAGA movement, with massive followings and the ability to inject Kremlin-aligned narratives deep into American political discourse. The content that they produced was directly controlled and directed by RT employees and was viewed by millions upon millions of Americans. The FBI affidavit that I mentioned earlier also revealed that the Kremlin directed its communications contractors to monitor nearly 3,000 Western influencers who regularly align with Moscow, while simultaneously targeting 1,900 anti-influencers. Probably some of those people are in this room today. Russian communications firms were instructed by the Russian presidential administration not only to exploit existing divisions in Western societies, but to engineer new conflicts where none existed before. This is conflict engineering, using polarization as a weapon. It is likely that the delays in US weapon and aid to Ukraine in 2024 was driven by, and which was driven by illiberal populist members of the Republican caucus, were shaped at least in part by such operations. And using, again, the impact scale, that represented the most severe level of foreign influence, which is, again, a level 5 outbreak. Next slide, please. Now, finally, with the US government eliminating almost all resources and funding to defend against this threat, the burden now falls on civil society and activists like all of us in this room to help pick up the slack. We need to coordinate our efforts and work with governments who do support our collective mission. We need their support in exposing and holding influencers and enablers to account. And we all need to do our part to warn elected officials, their staff, and media of anticipated narratives and future operations. Ukrainians are sacrificing everything to defend their freedom and ours. We must collectively do all that we can to ensure the Kremlin's lies and influence operations do not succeed where its tanks and missiles have failed. Thank you, and Slava Ukraini.
Thank you. I think we'll turn to another front, not the North American or the Western front, but to the Ukrainian front, and but also a person who has interacted with Europe and the United States extensively in recent years. But Yevhen Hlibovytskyi, I think, wants to talk a little bit about the state of disinformation inside Ukrainian space and the kinds of mechanisms that society is creating to counter them, to cope with them, and their impact inside and outside of Ukraine. So Yevhen, please.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I really like this notion of being in the United States, but at the same time being in the Ukrainian Village. Disinformation is something that we live in without very often realizing this. It's similar to hacking. You have either been hacked by the Chinese hackers or you don't know about it. So with disinformation, this is about not about particular piece of propaganda that will brainwash us and we will start believing into something. No, it's a much deeper thing. And we've passed this direct propaganda approach probably 50 years ago. Now it works much, much deeper. And the essence of this disinformation lies in attempt to change the way we consume information and change the way we make our decisions. So it's basically about playing in with our prejudices, with our beliefs. A lot of the groups that the people who are here, maybe even me included, subscribe to on Facebook and other social networks that reflect our beliefs, that reflect our, in many cases, patriotic feelings, our ideological feelings, have been created by the Russians not because they share the same goals with us, not because they like it, but because what they want to make sure is that we switch in our operations, in our manifestation of these beliefs, into a zero-sum game. So the point is not to persuade us. The point is to change our modus operandi. The point is to change the way we consume, the way we perceive, the way we talk about it, the way we discuss it, the way we act upon the information. And any disinformation efforts that are taken by a number of institutions, number of organizations, I think they're incredible. In many cases, they're incredibly selfless and they actually contribute a lot. But it's difficult to efficiently debunk because usually the lie spreads, but then the debunking of that information actually is not as efficient as the original lie. So when we're talking about disinformation, it's very important to take the more strategic approach. And one of that is realization that operating modern information space requires competences that are not traditionally engraved in our culture. That basically we have to imply critical thinking, that we have to imply certain hygiene we haven't been washing our hands with soap 200 years ago, and we lived on average 35 years. And now if we want to be more successful in the kind of quality of life that we have to consume information in the right way. And that means that we have to embrace this complexity. We've done that many times in our lives. We've learned to drive, we've learned to use computers, we've learned to do online payments. This is just another thing that we have to add up onto our agenda. And while doing that, we have to make a few assumptions that are not obvious. First, lies are free, truth is expensive. And if we get something for free, we should always ask the question, who's paying for that? And why are we getting this for free? So in that sense, we have to understand that very often when we get the information that we did not subscribe, or get the information that we did not ask anyone to get on our behalf, basically this means that we're being a product at that point. And this means that it's incredibly important to understand that we're losing the freedom and downgrading ourselves to pluralism. There's huge difference between pluralism and freedom. Pluralism is what we currently have on Fox versus CNN. But I remember the time when CNN had conservative commentators. At the same time, it's critically important, especially as we see from the Ukrainian case, to have a successful public broadcast service. Because what public broadcast service does, it takes the taxpayers' money and it provides, it's basically a healthy food or healthy information option for the consumer. Now, the problem that happened in the United States and the problem that happened in many other countries is that public service broadcast has basically become a niche media for its own bubble. And it has probably failed to persuade the public that it is actually acting in public interest, regardless whether they like or don't like what they hear in the air. And basically, defunding of PBS and NPR is something that leads to further decay, to further disruption of the information space in the United States. And that basically means that if a public service broadcasters or the network of broadcasters is lost, it doesn't only affect those people who were consuming these broadcasters. Because what's happening, all the other private media know that they've lost someone who could check on them. So that means that other private media will be more brutal in constructing their own virtual reality. And the last thing that I want to say is that we have to be incredibly timely with what we do. The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians are now feeding huge volumes of information to AI systems. And one thing is when you meet someone on a plane or when you meet someone at the bar who's been brainwashed and is spreading you lies. A completely different situation is when you will be arguing facts and the artificial intelligence will be telling you, no, 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 no. Crimea was always Russian. And that basically means that we have to require to have ethical guidelines imposed onto the way the AI is operating. But in a situation when we are basically in the middle of this information war, no one is doing that. The United States government is not doing that. The Russians are not doing that. The Chinese are not doing that. And the Europeans are doing it in a rather limited fashion, rather limited way. One of the things that saves Ukraine and saves Ukrainians in this situation is that Ukrainians have an extra filter in their consciousness. Because Ukraine came from and probably Estonians too, I think, yeah, Ukrainians and others who have been under the Russian and under the Soviet oppression have an extra layer of distrust. And in some cases, distrust can actually act as a substitute for critical thinking. And this distrust actually helps Ukrainians to be less poisoned by the way the Russians operate. But at the same time, we have to understand that we cannot only rely on our distrust, we actually have to upgrade ourselves to critical thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yevhen. You invoked AI, and I was thinking Russia is probably developing its own AI platform, which they will name Mearsheimer in the future.
Is he from Chicago?
Maybe.
I don't see him here.
Anyway, we have the privilege of someone who is on two front lines. On the front line of the battle of ideas within, I would say, the Republican and more conservative media universe, as well as the front lines of the war in Ukraine, Joe Lindsley, who I believe is online, and we're very grateful that he can join us, and we hope that, we've talked a lot about hybridity today, that he can do a hybrid presentation, both on how he is communicating the war to an American audience, and how he feels the impact of disinformation on the work that he has been doing. So we're very grateful to have you. Happy to hear from you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Can everyone hear me clearly? 1, 2, 3, check. Great, thanks. Well, hello from Kyiv. And I know that there's many people in the audience. I know I've received a lot of text messages the past minutes. And, Chicago I have a great affinity for. For the first 3 years of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, I spoke every single day, Monday through Friday. I never took a day off, live in Chicago, WGN Radio, every morning at 7:20 a.m. And it was great, and it was popular in Chicago. And very curiously, the parent company, News Nation, canceled my report, which I did for free, by the way, canceled it after the presidential election last fall. So I'm happy again here today to speak to Chicago. I've missed those reports every day. And by doing that daily journalism live on air, it really gave me a window into how Americans are understanding or not understanding what's happening here. I want to, I'll say the key to breaking propaganda's grip is this idea of empathy, or actually listening to the people whom we are seeking to persuade. And if we have time later, during the Q&A or such, I'd like to share with you, if there's a chance, 6 things that I think that Russia does not want President Zelensky to say to Donald Trump and to America, but we can get to that later. My mission is to, especially since I lost WGN, now I call myself a strategic journalist, and so I can work on information strategy. And that's what I've been doing for the past 8 months. And I want to be effective and not quixotic. I'm deeply thinking about whom we are trying to reach. That's what I did on the radio every day. That's how we were able to keep that show for 3 years. Because back in 2022, I realized that if I didn't deeply care about my audience, people were going to lose interest. Pretty soon it becomes Bakhmut every day. And no wonder people with busy lives and other demands will move on. Even, October 7th, they cut my show from 10 minutes to 5 minutes. And I fought like hell for the subsequent 2 days to keep Ukraine relevant and tied to what people were caring about. And so it really took a lot of active understanding of the American audience, of the Chicago audience, to keep that show alive. So now I translate that same principle to our information work, and what I'm really focused on is, who do we need to persuade? Who can move the needle? And so to that end, my focus is on helping Kyiv understand the White House and America and MAGA, and helping the White House understand why Ukraine matters and what Ukraine is. That's really all I'm interested in. I know people in the White House, I know people close to Trump and close to Vance, and so I do have some insight on what the thinking is. And my sort of first rule is that we have to deal in specifics. The only way to counter propaganda, firstly, is to respect the people we are trying to persuade. And the Russians the KGB had this tactic, which the Russians still employ, and I know some people in the audience know this well, the reflexive control. It's a complicated way of manipulating information, but it all starts by firstly listening to those whom you want to persuade, and in a sense, almost respecting them and honoring their mood. And so that's what we have to do on the side of freedom and on the side of Ukraine. And what this reflexive control does, it makes the propaganda stick because it attaches itself to legitimate grievances that people have. And for example, and I see this, I started my career at the Weekly Standard magazine, and I sort of left that world and changed my views on, for example, Iraq and American foreign policy. But many Americans who once supported George W. Bush, who once supported the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, no longer do. And they almost have a trauma about it, even though, even the ones who weren't there still have some kind of trauma that they believed in this stuff, and now they don't. And the Russians have played that up very well when it comes to Ukraine. So that's something to keep in mind. And, everything, what I try to do, I never tell someone you're being brainwashed, because that's a surefire way they're never going to listen to you. You're basically saying, I don't respect your emotions and your feelings. Unfortunately, the Russians are patient, and they do respect people's emotions in the sense of listening to them so that they can manipulate it, which of course is ultimately a disrespect. But so on our side, I think we really need to focus on that. And the way to look at what's happened since Trump's second term began, the Oval Office has become the most important and consequential reality television set ever. And this is in part by design. This is who Trump is. And I think one thing that people don't realize, like even European leaders go in there thinking they have to kiss up to Trump, but they don't realize there's a reason why the cameras are on, because you're not only speaking to Trump, you're speaking to America and to the people who voted for Trump. And Trump is like the Roman emperor in the Colosseum. The emperor would give the thumbs up or thumbs down, but he didn't always do it right away. He was first listening to the crowd, because you can't oppose the mob. You can't oppose the people who got you there. And so Trump does this, he uses these Oval Office optics to test, it is The Apprentice. It's the most important season ever of The Apprentice, and to test people and to see how they perform. And I think if we understand that, we have a better chance of getting the right arguments out there. I have a little bit of an understanding of that because my former mentor, from whom I escaped, was Roger Ailes, the founder and chairman of Fox News. I escaped in a car chase through the Hudson Valley and got out of there after a few years. But before Trump, Roger Ailes was the chief manipulator of American optics and American discourse. And that's because he understood the mood in America. And that's why he got Nixon elected and Reagan elected, et cetera. And Trump sort of toppled Ailes in 2016, and Trump understands it better than Ailes ever did. And so we really have to sort of appreciate that and realize that when I try to get people in Kyiv to understand, when you're speaking to Trump, you are speaking to America. And so one quick example of this in a practical way, the European leaders at the White House summit last Monday, they started to use the language that Trump started to use several months ago. And they thought they were being quite smart about this. We need to stop the killing. Oh, Trump said stop the killing, so let's say stop the killing. The problem is, or the missed opportunity is this. Trump, a week before, so last week, or 2 weeks ago, he changed his rhetoric. He stopped saying stop the killing. He actually started to say something that's actually better. When he put the secondary tariffs on India, he said we need to stop I'm punishing India because they are funding the Russian war machine. And that, I was so happy when I saw that. It's something I've been personally working for him to understand and see, because if Russia is a Russia war machine, then supporting Ukraine no longer means supporting forever war, which is one of the main sticking points of Russian propaganda for MAGA. Now that you have the president of the United States saying, wait a second, I'm going to punish the people who are funding the Russian war machine, And Ukraine then, all of a sudden, they are at the vanguard of stopping this war machine. That's incredible. That's exactly the optics that we need to break the propagandist hold on Americans. But no one paid attention to it. I think because people, because people don't want to be strategic about it, because it's easier just to complain. And the European leaders with their massive resources, again, thought they were being smart, but their news was not up to date. And so what I do is I really pay attention to every bit of communication. And even when Trump said that when he first signaled that maybe he was starting to see that Russia was bad, just a few weeks ago, remember he said Putin is full of BS. My first thought is, okay, what are the Russians going to do? Because the Russians cannot allow that. They cannot have United States and Ukraine be allied, because that would be the end of Russia. And so they cannot have Trump be on Ukraine's side. So every time Trump starts to move in a good way, the Russians are, of course, going to go into overdrive. And by the way, the first word that came to my mind when I woke up in Kyiv and saw that Trump had said that Putin was full of BS was Epstein. And sure enough, when America woke up a few hours later that day, what was the trending topic? It was Epstein. Because if you're a Russian, Trump can only have so many MAGA rebellions. He had a rebellion with Iran, and he was able to contain it. And then what, 3 weeks, but MAGA was starting to get a little pissed at him because they don't want forever foreign wars. A few weeks later, he signals he might be, turning toward Ukraine and against Russia. Well, sure enough, a few hours later, he's got another fire in his hands with Epstein. And I guarantee you the Russians had a hand in that. And so we have to A, pay attention to that and find ways to counter it. And I'll say this quote from Cicero that I like and that sort of drives me every day in the work I'm doing. If you wish to persuade me, you must think my thoughts, feel my feelings, and speak my words. And if we can put ourselves in that mindset with this empathy for our fellow Americans whom we're trying to persuade, including President Trump, and realize this, that even if Trump is starting to realize that Russia is bad, he needs something, some reason to sell as a salesman to the MAGA base. And so far, he's not quite getting that. So far, the Ukrainians are not kind of giving him that script. And I think in these moments when we see that he's more amenable to opposing Russia, that's the time to pour on the positive stories, the positive arguments about Ukraine that would resonate with MAGA.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your comments, and thank you for invoking the dreaded idea of forever wars. But it always strikes me that no one ever sees the war against Ukraine as Russia's forever war. And I think we should change the lexicon. It is not the US's, it's not even Ukraine's forever war, it is Russia's forever war. It's Russia's choice to wage this forever war. Anyway, to move on to our final speaker, we have to move on with the overall time frame of the conference. If you could speak for maybe 5 or 6 minutes, David Kirichenko, who has done, very serious research in the area of cybersecurity. He has analyzed the war effort and brings those insights also into our broader discussion of disinformation. So David, please, the floor is yours.
All right, everyone, thank you for coming here today. It's truly a pleasure to be here. Maria, everyone that helped put this event together. I had just recently came back from the front lines, and every time I get into the trench and the soldiers see me and they just stare at me, and usually the first reaction is like, what are you doing here? And we just stare at each other. But once we get to know each other, I explain that there's so many people out there, both Americans, Ukrainians, Europeans, they all want to know what's happening here, and they want the truth. There's so many lies, and Russia's just built the whole concept of what's going on in Ukraine, the war with the West, from top down. It's just built on lies. And even in the front lines, when we're in that trench and the Russians were conducting an assault on the position, you had Russian infantrymen crawling through fields, walking through fields, being blown up by drones. And then they begin with the motorcycle assaults, and they're just charging and charging every hour and dying. And then Ukrainian intelligence, they intercepted over the radio that the Russian assault commander promised his troops 2 weeks of vacation if they survived this assault, which is a lie. None of them survived that assault. And this facade that Putin builds, that we have real security concerns about needing to bomb Ukrainian cities on a daily basis, and somehow that's going to protect Russian interests. So again, thank you everyone for what you're doing, and I think that's the essence of being able to promote Ukraine's messages, gatherings like this, telling the truth and letting Americans and the world know of what's truly happening in Ukraine. Because I've saw it up close, and it's like a cancer, it's a disease, and it wants to spread and grow, and no matter how much they distort the truth, like I see what they're doing. They bomb, kill innocent civilians. They wipe every single settlement that's in front of them, every village, every building is just destroyed, and everything that they occupy, there's nothing left in the vacuum. And disinformation in itself has an impact directly on the battlefield. If we think about when the US Congress paused aid for Ukraine, and Ukraine was starved of artillery shells for the battle for Avdiivka, they had to become far more reliant on the use of drones and how they innovated drone warfare. But of course, you can't solely substitute drones for artillery and other traditional means of warfare. And so with very little, the Ukrainians continue to rely on themselves, innovate wherever they can. But it's also a volunteer-driven effort, is that so much of the soldiers rely on these supply chains from the volunteers. And the more that disinformation prevails, both within Ukrainian society, American society, the less donations that are showing up right now, both for soldiers and for a lot of organizations, but the needs are far greater than ever. And so we see that there's a direct connection to how powerful and how strong the disinformation is in it, and how it ties back to the battlefield. And also, Russia does not want you to know that Ukraine is a leader in AI, drone, robotics warfare. I had the opportunity to go throughout the front, visit different brigades that are now using AI-enabled drones to strike long-range targets inside Russia. They're flying these AI drones. I mean, you have a Russian infantryman that just steps out from a tree line, and they already have these AI targeting drones going after these Russians. They don't want you to know that, sure, they may have manpower issues, but robotics are now taking over parts of the front line. They're conducting logistics, evacuation missions, and for every gap that Ukraine has, they're out-innovating the Russians. And that's the reason why we're well 3.5 years into the war that the Russians thought they would win in 2 years. They don't want you to know that Ukraine is becoming more powerful. And with these missiles, long-range drones that they're developing, as the war goes on, is going to become far more painful for the Russians. And I think especially how surprised the whole world is when they pull off Operation Spiderweb, when they bring these trucks filled with these little drones, wipe out just numerous strategic bombers that even have harassed the US and Alaska. And so the Russians don't want you to know any of this. And when you talk to people in the West, and they're like, oh, I hear Ukraine's struggling, or oh, I saw this video of a person pulled into the van. But then you don't hear about the 99% of cases where these men, throughout the war of their own free will, went to go fight. And you have units of just a very small unit, and they're relying on online fundraisers, gathering money, and they're building just robotics by hand with the minimal resources, attaching like a rocket launcher, a machine gun, welding it to a ground robotics drone, and deploying it, what was the world's second largest army. So Ukraine is strong, and it's powerful. And I think over time, Trump is going to really like more of what is coming from Ukraine, and he's going to want to partake in that show. And so we need to be telling Ukraine's story, telling the truth, because Ukraine has nothing to hide. Truth is on our side, and we just need to keep fighting against it, showing the power of Ukraine, what it can do. And again, we're in year 4 of the war, and there's so much more brilliance that is to come from Ukraine. And Russia does not want you to know that Ukrainian intelligence is operating across the Middle East, Africa, hunting Russian operatives there, helping send drone operators to Syria to help topple the Assad regime. And this whole narrative that Ukraine is losing, I mean, they want us to think that. They want our Congress, they want our constituents to think that. But in reality, again, having just come from the battlefield, the fact that you have these Russians crawling through fields using Stalingrad type of tactics to try to gain mere inches of land at times, where Ukraine is deploying AI drones, robotics, and with very minimal resources, holding off the second biggest army in the world. needing the support of the North Koreans and the Chinese. Imagine what Ukraine can do if it had the weapons and everything that it needed. Not only would it further push the bounds of innovation, both for Europe and NATO, but I mean, it can help win this war against the axis of evil, Russia, China, Iran. History doesn't happen in isolation. All these events are interconnected. So we need to continue to promote the truth. Russia is backed by the axis of evil. They're growing stronger technologically the more that we allow the war to go on. And if Russia was to absorb Ukraine, you would have a far more powerful Russia with access to Ukraine's industries, waging war across Europe. And so it's very important to be able to tell that truth at the ground level for each person, to go to members of Congress, to every organization, and just talk about Ukraine, keep it in the news, because otherwise Ukraine is going to have to rely on invading Russia itself, invading Kursk, and it was the first time in a year that polling showed that America believed that Ukraine was winning the war. And so the less that we're talking about and promoting the truth, the more that Ukraine has to pull off more daring and dangerous missions. And so it's important to keep Ukraine in the spotlight, no matter the cost, keep telling the truth, because the Russians never back down, and for them, they see so much return on promoting the lies and the falsehoods about what's happening on the front line, what's happening in Ukraine. Ukraine is not losing. It is still in this war, and with the right amount of help, Ukraine can still win the war.
David, thank you. We have about 5 minutes, and I want to do justice to the questions that have come up, and which probably are too late to be even read by now. But the predominant questions by democratic ballot were around the unilateral disarmament of the battle against disinformation, the closing of VOA, the disinformation monitoring instruments that the United States had been supporting. I'd like the panel to talk a little bit about whether we should simply regard this as surrendered territory, or is this an important priority, even in this environment, to continue to fight back on and to try to restore. This is, after all, the legacy of, the Cold War. It's a legacy of institutions were under attack, like the National Endowment for Democracy. That's a Reagan legacy. I guess Truman Eisenhower is the, radio broadcasting. If I could get the panelists each maybe for a minute or so to respond on what we should be doing about this, their judgment about this, the damage that has been done, and what can be done should anything be done to reverse it, or should we just rely on other people to fill the gap?
Okay, well, the US situation is not all that different from the Ukrainian situation. Most of the political elites, probably with few decent, rare exceptions, don't really like the notion of being checked by the media. And so Suspilne, the Ukrainian public broadcaster, usually has significant political opposition. And it has to operate under this significant political opposition. And if the politicians could, they would probably shut it down. But they can't. And the reason why they can't do that is because there's a constituency in a society that no one wants to test whether it's big enough to block this move and then present a political cost. So I think it's important for these media to understand that they don't only exist, but they also have to build a constituency among the public. And I'm not sure whether the reliance on institutions in the United States helped that. I think one of the things that happened, the institutional development that the US enjoyed was taken for granted. And once things were disrupted from the top, there is no backup plan. There is nothing to rely on. Ukrainians come from the assumption that the institutions are weak, they malfunction, they don't always deliver. Therefore, we always have to have parallel institutions that would safeguard, that would basically allow to make sure that if the formal system breaks, we have a substitute that can step in. And this is how basically even the public broadcaster appeared. Before Suspilne came to exist, there was Hromadske, which was a public or I would say civil society version of public broadcaster. And I'm not sure what can be done now in the United States. One of the things that always fascinates Ukrainians is how unwilling the Americans are to protest. Ukrainians would have probably had 3 Maidans by now already, but you know, even during the war, one of the things that happened was this cardboard revolution, as we call it now, with young kids stepping in and actually making sure that the independence of the anti-corruption institution states, by the way, very, very unpopular anti-corruption institutions, because when the anti-corruption institutions that were protected, they were trying to gain popularity and say that this is, you know, they're so good that people are protecting them. They got a criticism from the protesters saying, "Shut up, you know, we'll talk about you later." And I think this is the moment when probably, with all due respect, the Ukrainian experience can be useful elsewhere beyond Ukraine, not necessarily as a solution, but at least as an inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question for Joe Lindsley, and we have to defer to the audience, but you will be happy that this question is, so what are the 6 things that Russia does not want Zelensky to tell the American people or Donald Trump?
I set it up on purpose. First, quick note on the dissolution of American public media. Good thing is the people we're trying to persuade didn't never listen to that. So that's not our immediate concern. And this is why, for example, it was my project to bring Ben Shapiro to Ukraine. It was hard to get it was hard to get Zelensky's team to understand why that was important. It took 4 months, but Ben agreed right away. And here's where we really have to quadruple our efforts to get Ukrainians and pro-Ukrainian voices in the American podcast sector. That's how, Trump went on the podcast before he became president. That worked. We should be running this like an American political campaign. Okay, and now quickly, the 6 points, 6 things that, as I put it, Russia does not want Zelensky ever to say to Trump. 6 things I hope Zelensky would say to Trump. Let's see, All right, first, Ukraine is stopping the Russian war machine. Together, America, Ukraine, and free Europe will end forever wars. That's number 1. Number 2, no deal is possible without the Ukrainian people's approval, as proved by the massive July protest, aka the cardboard revolution, against a bill that I signed. If Zelensky says that, it will own the idea of Ukrainian democracy. That would be incredibly powerful. I want Zelensky to say these words. Number 3, from Ukraine's strong military to its vibrant culture and beautiful faith in God, Ukraine is making Europe great again. Ukraine is the Texas of Europe. Ukraine is the America of Europe. That would be a huge hit with MAGA and with Trump. Next, alluding to a lot of the reporting that David Kirichenko has done, Ukraine's drone tech plus America's big weapons equals a free and flourishing West, a new golden age of freedom for the world. Let's deport the illegal Russian immigrants and their Chinese, North Korean pals from noble European soil. Number 5, Mr. Trump and the American people, Washington has lied to all of us for decades. Washington elites, they lied to the Americans about Iraq and so much else. And guess what? Washington elites, Republicans and Democrats, lied to the Ukrainian people too. Because in the 1990s, under Clinton's Budapest Memorandum, they promised to protect us, and they all have lied to us. So we are united. I want Zelensky to say, I'm united with the American people in deep frustration with the decades of lies from Washington. Let's change that. And lastly, and this is where we get to the personality of President Trump. There was a moment when Zelensky and Trump met in the Oval Office on Monday, and Trump extraordinarily gave Zelensky credit. He looked to him and he said, "You've been through hell." Trump said that to Zelensky. I'm looking for these moments because I want to boost them and build them and give more oxygen to them. But Zelensky was quiet. And just imagine this. When Trump looked to Zelensky and said, "You've been through hell," with like really, with a good degree of empathy. Imagine if Zelensky had said this. And I know it might make some people not happy, but imagine if he'd said this. Mr. Trump, so have you. They've tried to kill you. You faced bullets. I faced ballistic missiles. Let's get through this together. Let's stand for freedom together. Had he said that, he would have won Trump's heart, and he would have done a good job of winning the hearts of much of MAGA. That's it.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, panel. I want to say to the organizers that this, at least, I don't know how many other questions came for the previous panel. There are 17 questions here. So I think this theme of how you communicate, how you combat, and how you shape messages should be given more space than simply a simple panel on disinformation in next year's conference. But thank you for an excellent panel. Thank you for so much unappreciated audience engagement. And we have a 10-minute break, coffee break. Let's enjoy that moment.